Danger Along the Ohio, Chapter 8. Amos came awake at Clara's hand on his shoulder. He had slept soundly, partly because of the previous sleepless night, but even more because of the fire's heat and smoke had kept the mosquitoes away. He looked around. The woods were still, not a leaf rustled. Even the night birds had ceased their calling. Without a word, Clara lay down on a pile of leaves and spread her shawl over her shoulders. Not long after, Amos heard her soft, regular breathing. He sat up, spread his hands to the heat. It wasn't a big fire, but its steady light held back the night shadows. The bed of embers pulsated and glowed like candlelight on red velvet. His thoughts drifted back to their fireplace in Pennsylvania. They had lived their lives around the perpetual fire. They awoke to its crackling warmth. They ate beside it, worked and read and played in its evening light, and went to sleep with its soft gleam flickering on the log walls. As Amos stared, his father's face seemed to take form in the hot coals. The piercing eyes held a message for Amos. See before you are seen, and remember, there are always Indians. He rose to his feet and crept around the campfire. The Indian boy lay on his back, his face chiseled sharp against the firelight. Placing a hand on the thin chest, Amos could feel the boy's breaths, though they rattled beneath his fingers. At least he was still alive. They might never find out where or how he was shot, but Amos felt sure he had been trying to get home. Was there someone worrying and waiting for his return? When darkness finally paled into day, Amos rose to his feet and stretched. Glancing at the Indian, he stiffened and his breath caught in his throat. The boy's eyes were open and fastened directly on him. Gleaming like black stone, they held no hint of friendliness or fear. Amos tried to meet that steadfast gaze with equal calm. He nodded a silent greeting. The Indian continued to stare, and Amos was sure he was trying to piece together where he was and what had happened. Amos edged over and picked up the tin cup of water. He held it out, not knowing whether to help the boy or wait for him to take the cup himself. The Indian looked at Amos a moment longer, then turned his head away and closed his eyes. Placing the cup within the boy's reach, Amos went back to the fire. He watched the Indian, and when several minutes passed without a sign of movement, Amos guessed he was either asleep or too sick to stir. Amos shivered and leaned closer to the fire. He could still see the Indian's eyes, cold and unblinking, the eyes of an enemy. Amos jumped at a sudden sound. It was only Clara, sitting up, shaking out her rumpled shawl. She scooted close to the fire and held out her hands to the heat. He was awake, Amos said to her, but he didn't say anything. I better look at his dressing, Clara said, and rose to her feet. Remembering the Indian's fierce expression, Amos rose and grabbed her arm. Wait, you better not. I'm not afraid of him, Clara said. After losing all that blood, he's weaker than a newborn colt. When he starts to mend, that's the time to worry. She went over and knelt beside the boy, and as she lifted the cloth from his wound, the boy tried to push her away. She captured the brown hand and laid it back on his chest. You just lie still and don't interfere, she said in the same tone she would have used to tell Jonathan to wash his hands before supper. The boy's jaw tightened, but his hand remained where she had put it. After replacing the dressing, Clara picked up the cup of water. She slid a hand under the boy's shoulder and pulled him up, then held the cup to his lips. He just stared at her without drinking. I don't care whether you drink or not, Clara said to him, just as if he could understand her. But if you want to get better, you'll have to have liquids. Their eyes met in a silent struggle. At last, the boy took a sip of water, then drank until the cup was empty. When Clara lowered him to the ground, his gaze flickered over to Amos. His eyes seemed to be saying something, though Amos had no notion of what it might be. Clara returned to the fire and stood with her hands on her hips. Well, it appears that your Indian will live, Amos. Now what do you propose we do with him? She didn't give Amos time to answer. He can't walk and he needs food. Where are we going to get food for him? We don't even have food for ourselves, and we should be on our way downriver. The longer we linger in these woods, the more likely we risk being... Hush, sister, you'll wake up the Indian, came Jonathan's scolding voice. He stooped to warm himself at the fire. His clothes, as well as his face and his arms, were mud-splattered from yesterday's frog hunt. Somehow, though, he had managed to keep his beaver hat clean. Amos looked down at his own clothes. He was every bit as dirty. A bath in the creek would be a welcome improvement for both of them. "What about him, Amos?" Clara asked again. It was quite a change, her asking Amos for his opinion. Usually she made decisions without consulting anyone. He was slow to answer. "It wouldn't be right to leave him here alone when he's so helpless," he said at last. "How about leaving him down by the Ohio?" Clara suggested. "We could make him a fire so the Indians would find him." "What if some of our people find him first?" Amos asked. "You know very well a boat won't stop on the north bank for anyone." "Clara, it won't make any difference if we arrive at Marietta a couple of days later than we planned, will it?" Clara frowned at him. "What about food? Every day we spend in the woods, we get hungrier." Her steady gaze made Amos squirm, and he tried to offer some explanation. "I didn't think when I pulled him out of the river," he began. "You mean if you had to do it over again, you'd let him drown?" Clara asked, her eyes filled with impatience. Amos shook his head no. There was no question in his mind. He would have saved the Indian even if he had a week to think about it. He couldn't explain how he felt. All he knew was that he couldn't abandon the boy. Minutes passed, and finally Clara picked up a log and threw it on the fire. It was a signal of surrender. "I'll milk Queen Anne, and we'd better start looking for something to eat. And I'll need some willow bark." After drinking their fill of milk, Amos and Jonathan headed toward the Ohio. They gathered several strips of willow bark and collected dead wood for their fire. In their wandering search, they came across a black walnut tree. Beneath it were lots of nuts, still encased in winter-blackened husks. They used Amos's shirt to carry the precious load back to camp. Scavenging for rocks, they were soon at work cracking open the hulls and the inner shells to get to the rich kernels. Later, Amos and Jonathan returned to the creek, hoping to capture more frogs. In the backwater they had hunted the day before, they could see and hear their prey, but overnight the frogs had grown wary. Despite hours of patient stalking, they could only capture 4. At Amos's suggestion, they submerged themselves in the gently flowing creek, washing the mud and slime from their bodies and their clothes. As they lay on the sunny bank and watched the drifting clouds, a flock of Carolina parakeets settled into a nearby tree. A large green bird fluttered through the foliage, and sometimes, when several landed on the same limb, it cracked beneath their weight. "If only we could catch one of those, we'd have a real supper," Jonathan said. "You might as well forget about them," Amos said. "We couldn't even get close to them." "What about Clara's gun? If we had it, we could shoot one from here." Seeing Amos's face, Jonathan hurried on. I know you couldn't shoot it, Amos, but I could. Big as they are, I bet I could hit one too." Amos stood up. "When are you going to remember this is Indian country? Shooting off a gun would be like sending them an invitation to come get us." He grabbed the frog stick and stalked off. It was always there in their midst, he thought, that moment none of them could ever forget, and everyone made excuses for him. When he saw them shy away from mentioning Simon, saw their careful evasions, he wanted to run away. It wasn't right for them to be burdened by guilt too. He was to blame, not them. As they came into sight of camp, Clara ran to meet them. "Amos, he's got a knife. I thought he might want to keep the bullet I took out of him. I was trying to put it in the leather pouch when he pulled a knife out of his boot." "Did he hurt you, sister?" Jonathan asked. "No, I got away from him quick," Clara said, "but I'm not doing another thing for him if he's going to threaten me with a knife." "I reckon he's feeling better," was all Amos could think of her to say to her. "We've got to get that knife away from him, Amos," Clara went on. "I'll never be able to sleep knowing he's lying there plotting murder, even if that wound doesn't keep him from taking up his savage ways. I told you we should have—" "Here," Amos broke in, handing her the stick with the clean frogs on it. Then he walked toward the Indian. The boy held a short-bladed knife in his right hand, and the look in his eyes reminded Amos of a wounded wildcat. Weak from loss of blood, unable to get away, he still showed no fear. Amos tried to keep his voice even and firm. "My sister wanted to give you the bullet she took out of your leg. She wasn't snooping. You better give me the knife." "He can't understand you, Amos," Clara called from a safe distance. "He may not understand the words," Amos replied, "but he knows what I want." He took a step closer, then stooped down and rested his arms on his knees. He held out his hand, showing his open, empty palm. The boy's eyes flitted to Amos's hand, then back to his face, and a low growling sound broke the silence. The words were unintelligible, but there was no denying the scorn in the Indian's voice. Amos felt a flicker of admiration. The boy must be in terrible pain, yet he still found the strength to challenge them. It would be too dangerous to try to take the knife away, Amos knew. His only hope was to coax the boy into giving it up. Before Amos could speak, the Indian let out a soft, shuddering breath. His hostility seemed to melt like butter in a hot skillet. Though he made no other sound, his eyes narrowed, and the hand holding the knife fluttered upward in feeble protest. Amos could almost feel the power of the pain. He looked around at Clara. "Haven't you got something in your bag to help him?" "No, the medicine box was on the boat," she said. "All I can do is change his compress, but I'm not going to do anything until he gives up that knife." Amos agreed with Clara that none of them should go near the boy as long as he wielded the weapon. To the Indian, they were the enemy. Amos extended his hand again. "Let me have the knife." A grim defiance darkened the boy's face once again, and he stared at Amos without moving. He doesn't understand the words, Amos thought, but he gets the meaning. He's thinking over the situation and trying to decide what to do. The moment of decision came sooner than Amos expected. In slow, clumsy movements, the boy laid the knife on his chest, turned it around, picked it up by the blade. Then he reached out and laid the knife in Amos's waiting hand. As Amos's fingers closed around the warm handle, he let out a quiet sigh, but the feeling of triumph died when he saw the look on the Indian's face. Despite the look of outward calm, the boy appeared to shrink back within himself. He was beaten. He had shown weakness. In some strange way, Amos understood. The boy had willingly given up his weapon to the enemy, and it shamed him. Amos hefted the knife. With its wide blade and thick bone handle, it was a knife made for killing. His gaze slid from the weapon to the Indian. Then he made a surprising decision of his own. He grabbed the knife by its blade, held it out to the Indian boy. Behind him, he heard Clara gasp. The Indian's eyes widened, then he expelled a slow breath and took the offered knife back. He raised up high enough to slide it into his moccasin before he sagged to the ground again and closed his eyes. "Why in heaven's thunder did you give the knife back to him?" Clara blurted out. "He's not going to hurt anyone," Amos said. "Come on over here. You better see about this bandage."
Ooh-wee!